Welcome to Act and Unwind, an ongoing conversation on a free and virtuous society. I'm your host, Eric Cohn. I want to thank you for listening, and I want to ask that if you're listening to us on our website, that you navigate right now to the show notes for this episode, where you will find a link to subscribe directly to Act and Unwind at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else where you listen to fine podcasts. And if you like this program, please leave us a 5-star review at Apple Podcasts so as to help more people find our show. This week, I'm joined by Dan Huger, Acton's librarian and a research associate, and Dylan Pauman, executive editor of the Journal of Markets and Morality and a research fellow here at Acton. This week, we'll be discussing Brazil's January 6th moment and the return of the famously wrong Paul Ehrlich to the scene. But first, there has been a discovery, multiple discoveries at this point, of classified documents not properly maintained, not properly handled, that have been found in the possession of current President Joe Biden, former Vice President Joe Biden, documents that apparently were taken when he left the vice presidency. And we've now found it in a number of different places. This think tank that has been set up at the University of Pennsylvania, his own home in Delaware. And this, of course, in the wake of the huge story about President Trump's handling of classified documents that he took when he left the presidency down to Mar-a-Lago, how those have been handled, how the fight over getting them returned has developed, that it resulted in an FBI raid, if we want to call it a raid. There's dispute over whether or not we should call it a raid. Negotiations with the National Archives over attempts to get it back. And what interests me not a whole heck of a lot is the actual, I guess, crux of the story of whether or not these documents were properly handled. Looks like the evidence in both cases testifies to no, they were not. I listened to the Dispatch podcast over the weekend where David French made the point, and I think this is well taken from somebody who would have knowledge of it, having formerly been a military official, that it is pretty easy to not mishandle classified documents if you really want to. So I think there is something interesting about kind of the wanton disregard for the norms of handling classified information that seems to be on evidence, not just from current President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump, but plenty of other people in the past. And there's been plenty of commentary as well on how the rules, the way the rules are enforced, the laws governing the handling and mishandling of classified information are disproportionately enforced. It seems like a very good case for those with wealth and privilege being subject to a different kind of justice than those who don't have those advantages. But the part of this that sticks out as interesting to me is why everybody seems to feel, not everybody, lots of people seem to feel the compulsion to make this a story about hypocrisy. That is people's primary concern here. To borrow a phrase from the Red Scare podcast, how it turns everybody into a truffle swine for hypocrisy. That every story, the goal of it is to root out where and how somebody is being hypocritical in the things they criticize the other side for doing. Saw this in my own Facebook feed of a friend of mine who was let's call him an anti-Trump guy, who looked at this and was like, wow, I must be missing all of the cries of outrage from my friends on the left about the story of Joe Biden's handling and mishandling of classified documents. And on one hand, okay, I get the point. On the other hand, why is this the focus? Why is this what seems to really matter so much to people, that there are double standards out there? This has always been one of my approaches to the question of media bias is like, yes, it is. And I've moved on from that years ago, but it is a point of obsession for a lot of people that wants to turn a story like this, which does have underlying importance and merit to conversation about how classified documents are handled. But it becomes only about what one side said about the other side when they did it, and what that side says about the other side when they find out that somebody there has done it too. That's what stands out to me.
So I have a working theory. I can't say it's an explanation because some actual social scientists should do some research to figure out why. But my thought is, and this will dovetail, I think, pretty well with the next topic. It all starts with the presidency and politics in general, national politics in general, being too big, too important to people. It is, as local media has waned for a variety of reasons, national news media, 24-hour news, you mentioned the bias. There is, of course, bias. There's right wing, there's left wing. But worse than that bias is the scope. It's all national. Everything anybody wants you to care about politically is at the national level. And we put so many eggs in this basket that for, president after president now, Republican and Democrat, has been basically legislating through executive order. They've been doing whatever they can to do whatever they can to score whatever points they can for their team. And it just has degenerated into this ridiculous tribalism where it doesn't matter. Yeah, there's, right or left. People look at something, and if their side does it, they say, oh, but the other side did it, right? Or if the other side did it, they say, well, why weren't you guys upset? When, and it's ridiculous. We should care about justice and order. We should care about our Constitution. And all of that is to say, I think the problem is once again that we get to vote in national elections. I did recently publish an essay on my harebrained theory along those lines, but not that voting is a problem. I'm very much pro-democracy, but we care so much about the national elections and so little about the local election, and I think it should be the exact opposite way around, because then you don't have as much partisan, heat and fire behind these sorts of things. It is bad. It is very bad for presidents, vice presidents, whomever, other government officials to be acting carelessly with classified documents. We don't know what were in the documents at Mar-a-Lago. We know a little bit of some general scope, but of course they are classified, so it's not exactly public information. Same thing with these ones. There are rumors. I don't know if it was a general statement. I didn't have time to look it up more, but there were supposedly some having to do with Iran and Ukraine. Both very important topics today, and very important topics 8 years ago when President Biden was Vice President Biden. I don't know that we're going to get the full story on that. To the extent that these are classified for a reason, they're probably not going to be public information. So instead, all this does is show that people in power do whatever they want and don't expect to be held to the same standard as everyone else. And so if anything, it's feeding the partisanship, but I'm sure it's also feeding a cynicism about our politics as well. And I'm, frankly, a little sympathetic to that everything is backwards in this sense. We need to have rule of law. If a normal person could not do it, someone in government should not be able to do it either.
I feel the need to also interject here one of the points made by New York Sun columnist and contributing editor at Commentary Eli Lake about classified information and the way that information becomes classified. During the Trump story, and I'll see if I can find the podcast where he discussed this, and in fact, I should probably get him on Acton Line to talk about classified information.
Get Trump on Acton Line?
Get Eli Lake on. Although, we certainly could reach out to Trump too. It's worth a try, maybe he needs some more attention. But Eli Lake's point about how we overclassify, and just hearing the intelligence sectors of the United States government look at what was allegedly uncovered. We know there were classified documents there. What's contained in them, the seriousness of all of that, we do not know. And I think Eli's point is because we overclassify to the extent that it is, we shouldn't take it on faith from the intelligence community how deeply serious it is that these documents, these specific documents, were found, not within the skiff, the room in which this kind of thing is supposed to be observed in and held in and not to leave. Which is not to say that it's not a violation of law as it is on its face, but that we should take with, at least a grain of salt, if not a full can of Morton's, to at least try to understand that just because we hear this is classified information does not mean that it is like the nuclear codes or the exact location. It's not like a knotless. This isn't necessarily a Jason Bourne movie. So I think we should remember that when we are hearing not only about the Trump story about classified information, but also this now Biden story about classified information.
So to paraphrase the late comedian Norm Macdonald, the worst part about this isn't the hypocrisy. It's the, classified documents floating around, evidently not known to be classified documents at the time by both presidents. Neither of the indication with neither of these is that this was sort of a heist that they pulled off, but this is just sort of carelessness. Now, the question that I'm left wondering, and this kind of dovetails into Eli Lake's thoughts about this, is what percentage of papers that get put in front of any given president are classified documents? And if that percentage is very, very high, it is in a way unsurprising if this is the day-to-day sort of paperwork they're dealing with that this happens. This strikes me as then a question of how are we handling this? How are we handling many presidents like to go home periodically on the weekend? They like to travel while they work. And is this a case that, you just need a room like in a bank where you open your safety deposit box? You have a meeting room in which classified documents are discussed, and outside of that room, they don't get discussed. This could be something that I could imagine would either be easily handled by instituting those sorts of rules and norms, or it would cause people to sort of re-examine just exactly how much information we're classifying. If you literally cannot function as president without bringing your classified documents home to work on over the weekend, then we have a problem with this system rather than, a problem of negligence.
Oh, I was just going to say, presidents of the United States really need to unionize and limit their work hours. It's hard for me to think, though, that there's not something more to it. I mean, yes, things are probably being overclassified. Presidents are probably overworked. On the other hand, our Attorney General, Merrick Garland, in both cases, has had to appoint a special investigator to look at, the message we're getting from the people whose responsibility it is to clean this up one way or the other, or sort it out, is not, oh, you know what, everybody cool down. This happens all the time. It's probably not a big deal. It's, oh, something happened. We got to figure out what went wrong. Now, maybe they're just overreacting. I don't know. But that's been my impression. I think that's the public's impression, that there's some kind of genuine negligence involved in both of these cases.
So, I mean, this is the question: is how frequently does this happen? Was Dwight Eisenhower carrying around classified documents in places? Until you catch Ike, you don't know. So this is a question of, we have this visibility. We don't know, or perhaps, this sort of thing used to be handled in a quieter manner than it is now. Because in both cases, these instigated a sort of press feeding frenzy where, these are very big stories. And we know how in less polarized times, the press was often, in fact, complicit in keeping government secrets, and that they felt a sort of loyalty to the nation in a way which caused them to oftentimes suppress information or overlook things that they knew were going on. And that's a question that the historians will have to judge.
There's an interesting point there about how much information and how fast information now spreads versus previous times. You brought up, Ike. That's one example. I think we could also look to stories of presidents and their infidelities. Bill Clinton, thanks to the emergence of the internet and specifically Matt Drudge, the story of the affair that he had with Monica Lewinsky becomes major news. If you separate out of it, especially if you know that story well, the internet portion of it for just a moment, it was something that was, I think it was Newsweek that had the story. And we're opting not to go with it. Very reminiscent of, say, the press in the 1960s, early 1960s, who knew a lot about the behavior of John F. Kennedy and chose not to report on it. That we were getting that again until Matt Drudge became aware of the story, broke it on a website, and really changed the way that information like this spreads forever. And I often think that this is one of the things that we have just really, when it comes to the internet, not fully grappled with yet. That the fact that we have the ability to access information about stories like this all of the time, everywhere, right? You know, to quote Bo Burnham for a minute, you know, can I interest you in everything all of the time? And our brains, our habits, we have not, I think, fully adjusted to that yet. And even when we think about, you know, was it 2005 really when Facebook becomes available to mass audiences? I remember signing up for Facebook in 2004 when you still needed a .edu email address in order to create an account on the Facebook. It was the Facebook at the time, much like a certain university in the state of Ohio that insists on the use of the definite article before its name. It was the Facebook. We really have only had a short period of time where the internet has been like this and information like this can spread. So I think Dan's point is a good one, that it doesn't change the underlying reality. Whether information that is classified was mishandled by Joe Biden or Donald Trump or Eisenhower or anybody else, if there is a problem with that, if that is the kind of thing we should be concerned about, we should be concerned about it. But we pay so much more attention to it now because information about it and granular information about it and information that can be manipulated about it and information that can be written about in a way that turns it into the kind of thing that I was talking about in the beginning, that it only becomes a story about hypocrisy. You can tell this story only about the hypocrisy of critics on either side and the things that they say. But that really isn't what's important. But again, I come back to this trend we have that becomes the only thing that we care about. The fact that there are double standards that exist for different people in the political system isn't good, but it also isn't the only or the most important thing, at least not to me.
It's also important to realize that the danger of classified documents getting out now is so much greater for documents that are of a digital nature as opposed to a paper nature. Both of these catches of documents were physical in actual places, residences owned by the respective presidents. What happens when a president takes a laptop with classified documents somewhere? When we talk about the major sort of leaks facilitated by WikiLeaks, these are massive amounts of digital documents, not paper documents. So I wonder also if our national security concerns aren't being framed by this debate unnecessarily, because, you know, these are both, you know, at the very least sort of negligent things that happened. However, there's also considerably less risk of, you know, pieces of paper with classified information existing in, let's say, a president or former president's, you know, office or home than there is with, you know, these things leaking out digitally, where they can be easily and seamlessly replicated and shared at, you know, the speed of light.
That is another good point about the way that the internet impacts this that just did not exist before the advent of the internet. Again, it is the same kind of quick spread of information. I always understood this to be one of the, and I think legitimate critiques of what Edward Snowden did, is that it was just a dump of all kinds of information, the relevance and importance and possible risks associated with were not really thoroughly evaluated before that information was made public. I think that has always been a critique that I think has been attached better to WikiLeaks and their approach to all of this than to what Edward Snowden did. But I can comprehend that as one of the more meaningful critiques of Edward Snowden. But again, this to me comes back to the approach that the federal government has to secrecy, that I never understood the Snowden argument from the people who very much believe that he is a traitor and should be executed. If you concede the point that what was revealed in what Edward Snowden stole, leaked, and disclosed to the public were things that the federal government was not really authorized to do, what was the alternative being proposed by those critics? That he should have worked through the system to expose the things that the system was doing? Are you honestly telling me that that is how you think it would shake out? It wouldn't be. It would be buried. So you can at one time not have to hold out someone like Edward Snowden as being a thoroughly virtuous individual, while, at least for me, being able to maintain a sense of appreciation for the fact that I know the extent to which the federal government was spying on American citizens for a long period of time. These things are complicated like that. And again, it gets to me why turning it only into a hypocrisy battle so ill serves the conversations that would be fruitful to come from this. A conversation about how much information are we classifying, what exactly is in there, how secret does it need to be, how the internet affects all of this, and the ability for these kinds of things to spread in a way that wasn't possible before. If you go read the story or watch the movie The Post about the Pentagon Papers and the exposure of the Pentagon Papers. I mean, these things had to be physically stolen and photocopied and handed off to journalists, and journalists go through all of it. And that is just not the way that even journalism operates anymore, where basically most things are written up by 24-year-olds who are just a couple years out of J school, have no context for anything whatsoever, and write it up in the most salacious way whatsoever, again, to feed these narratives that are about political agendas and hypocrisy only.
Yeah, if you think our octogenarian overlords have mishandled paper documents, can you imagine them in front of a computer? I don't see that going well.
That prince from Nigeria really did need some place for all of that money to be transferred.
I'm president of the United States, after all. I have a duty to.
Shouldn't you help out foreign heads of state when they're in need?
Right. But to get to the digital paper, it's even more stark than that. You can Control F on a computer document and find exactly what you're looking for. You don't have to read every word like you do with paper, right? There's just a time difference in terms of what it takes to go through these kind of documents. Even if you're scanning them, you still have to page by page, scan these in. So yeah, I don't know what the solution is. Maybe this is just always something that is going to be a risk, but I agree with Dan that we need some better procedures. I want to talk very briefly about the point you had made earlier, and you've kind of circled back to a little, on just the flood of information, having everything at our fingertips all the time. Another comedian, I guess we're all bringing up our favorite comedians today. Another comedian, Ronnie Chang, who's on The Daily Show, is one of my favorites, and he said, "Who would have thought that having all of human knowledge at our fingertips would make us so dumb?" Right? How would this make us dumber? But the thing is, A, there's a lot of misinformation on the internet, but B, just because people have information doesn't mean they know what to do with it, and not just what to do with it in terms of intelligence, but also in terms of morality. I'm sure someone has already written this cranky op-ed, but I was reminded a bit of Faust, who makes a deal with the devil for knowledge and pleasure at the small price of his soul. Right? This sort of giant dump and access to all the information, including all the fake information, all at once, has eroded civility. Now, I'm, just for the record, very pro-internet communications, even social media, but there are real downsides, too. I can be for those things and still acknowledge that people use them poorly all the time, and they've had some, you can't have any social gain without some negative externalities. That's just how it works in the world we live in. And so we've ended up with this weird sort of Faustian bargain And I don't know the story well enough to know if he ever gets out of it or if it's just tragic. I'm just going to say it probably turns out happy in the end, and we'll all be okay. Someone can correct me. But that's what I thought of. So, you combine that with then politics and with everybody putting all their eggs in the one basket of president in national elections. And now it's, this weird kind of cheerleading, school spirit, whatever sort of thing. We're going to beat the Blue Jays, or whatever. We're going to beat the Blues. They're going to beat the Reds. And we're going to cheer when they lose. We're going to cheer when we win. And that stuff is great for football. That stuff is terrible for politics. And we really need to think hard and seriously. And hopefully the people who can actually do anything about it need to think deeply and seriously about how to reform the structures of our politics to prevent that from always becoming the case, because it seems to be getting worse.
As Faust might say, linger a while, thou art so fair. This is my other question. And this is something that struck me, and this is totally speculation and wild at that. But is there a way that presidents like to keep these things, presidents and former presidents, officials in general, like to keep these things as sort of mementos?
This is why I've always, with the Trump story, the way that I wanted to look at it first, and I think we've talked about similar things to this, like a whole lot of what Trump says to me as the child of a New Yorker makes so much more sense if before Trump speaks in your mind you just say, like you're a radio host in New York, Donnie from Queens, go ahead. Like he sounds like a caller to WFAN in New York City, right? The guy who knows how to manage the Yankees better than the general manager of the Yankees. But with Trump in particular, it has always been more likely to be, right? Come back to our British friends, cock up before conspiracy, that the explanation for why he wanted all these documents is to be able to pull out and show things that are like, cool mementos and classified documents to impress people. Nothing more nefarious than that. That doesn't mean that a crime wasn't committed in all of this. That doesn't mean the law wasn't broken. But that just always struck me as the most plausible explanation, given what we know about the man himself, who liked to pull out copies of TV ratings of The Apprentice to show people to impress them.
And it's a given now that presidents, vice presidents, former government officials write a memoir. And, is this perhaps, collecting the material? And is this not perhaps just, again, as in the Lord of the Rings, after all, why shouldn't I keep it? I'm a trustworthy person. I was once privileged to have access to this information. Why should that revoke? And is this a question of you have people losing track of the nature between themselves as persons and the office that they are privileged to inhabit for a period of time?
So I would say maybe. But, I think if you want to impress people, you could also just build a building and put your name on the side of it, or, buy a Corvette. Both of which happened in both of these cases. There are other ways to do it, but yeah, maybe. Maybe that doesn't mean that they didn't decide. It's like you hear it all the time of actors working on a movie set. They steal some prop or a TV show or whatever, and then they're telling people about it and they're happy about it. I always think of there's some prop guy out there I was wondering where that went. It's still a minor crime, right, or misdemeanor.
But again, that's a confusion of the person with the role. This is now mine by virtue of what I was tasked to do, and I think you have that confusion a lot between the person in the office, and I think that's also symptomatic of the problems we encounter today throughout our politics.
Let's go to Brazil. I'm going to read the lead from the January 12th edition of the Morning Dispatch newsletter. The blow-up in Brazil. Supporters of former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro didn't succeed in returning him to power last weekend, but their storming of Brazil's federal seats of government may have curtailed his Orlando vacation. Never want to end your Orlando vacation earlier, especially not because the palace has been stormed. Just storm the Magic Kingdom. The Bolsonaro hasn't impeded the transition to a new government. He never formally conceded his October presidential election loss to leftist Lula da Silva. Apologies to anybody if I'm mispronouncing names here. It's just not my forte. Known as Lula. Even as courts rejected his party's evidence-free fraud claims. And when Lula was set to be sworn in on January 1, Bolsonaro skipped town, decamping to Florida, where he has been spotted swanning through the aisles of a Publix grocery store, signing fan shirts and chowing down on KFC. That sounds like a good vacation to me. Back in Brazil, supporters parroting Bolsonaro's election fraud claims aren't moving on so easily. In the months since October's runoff, they've blocked highways and camped near military installations, calling on the armed forces to overturn the election results. But their frustration boiled over last Sunday, 2 Sundays ago, when crowds ransacked Brazil's presidential palace, Congress, and Supreme Court. Once inside, the rioters lit carpet fires, stole artifacts, smashed windows, and beat journalists. Law enforcement finally regained control of the situation after several hours, arresting some 300 people Sunday and on Monday, detaining about 1,200 from a Bolsonaro supporters camp for questioning. About 600 of the detainees have since been released for, quote, humanitarian reasons like health conditions, but they may still be charged in the ongoing investigation. Boy, that story sure sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's hard not to think of our own problems on January 6, 2021. And think there was probably an inspiration here. Although, given how bad that went, I'm not sure why anyone would be inspired by it. But so it goes. So far, my understanding is no one has been killed, which is, thank God for that. But in many ways, this is probably more severe in terms of the scale. People were protesting outside of the Army headquarters. I'm going to get titles and buildings and things like that wrong because
we'll put the piece from the
not
Dispatch.
Brazilian, and so I'm going to get it wrong. But
yeah, we'll put the piece from the Dispatch in there for people who want a good fact-based rundown of all of this.
But they were calling for a military coup, which that's a very bad place to be in if you are supposed to be a democracy and a republic and a nation of laws and not men. For the men in your country to say, hey, how about the people with guns take control? Very bad. That's at least a step beyond how bad things were here. Military did not acquiesce to that, so that's good. My understanding also there was head of federal security. Again, I can't remember the exact title. His name was Torres, a Bolsonaro appointee who on January 6th, which is 2 days before what happened in Brazil, also flew to Florida. So he'd skipped town, and there was rumors that, and I believe I don't know if he's been arrested or they've issued an order to arrest him should they ever get a hold of him, sort of thing. But so there seems to be some possible very bad dealings inside the government as well. And I don't know, I look at this and there's many levels. There's terrible politicians, there's political corruption. There's also people, though. Why are people upset? They put a lot of hopes in their candidate. Again, this is a very, unfortunately, similar sort of situation where you have these big stakes in these national elections, and you have people who are not grounded in anything else. So now their whole identity and their whole worth is in their tribe, their political tribe, winning or losing. And these, if these people were happy, right? If they had some other basis of hope and stability, if they had some confidence in their government, no matter who was running it, to still run decently well, at the very least, we would not be seeing this on such a large scale. Which to me calls into question, what has gone wrong constitutionally in both cases, and it makes me think of, I would think more for the person, because there's a lot of just normal people there in the United States, a lot of Trump supporters who every now and then I see memes floating around of, oh, this was a peaceful protest and whatever.
Very similar rhetoric to things that we heard about January 6th.
Yeah, I think we want to learn about how to do a peaceful protest right. Today is Martin Luther King Day. Reread his letter to a Birmingham jail. He talks about his disappointment with the white moderate who is criticizing the civil rights movement, saying, we support you in your cause, but why you got to break all the laws? You're inciting violence. And he turned that around to them. He said, that's like blaming the person who got robbed for being involved in a robbery. What you do when the law has gone bad is you do protest, but you protest peacefully. You don't get makeshift weapons and storm the Capitol. You show up and you make your voice heard. And you also, as King said, as King certainly did, and he recommended others do, and many, many thousands, if not millions of others did, you let people execute those terrible laws. You protest them the entire time. You break them when they are unjust. But then you also accept the penalty as a rebuke to how unjust. It just makes it ridiculous. When you see, again, thinking back in our own history, people turning fire hoses on little kids and throwing them in prison, it could not stay the same when you saw that. That's obviously a huge cost. I understand people who would be reticent for that. But you have to start there. That's how you give love a social power that it otherwise does not have. That's how you take a step back from how do we hurt our enemies to how do we love our enemies in a way that isn't just a matter of giving into oppression. It's a very hard road to walk, but it's an example that people today really, really, really need to reflect on more, and today is a great day to do it.
One of the sort of perennial temptations as Americans is to view foreign events always through the lens of American experience. And, perhaps Karl Marx's best turn of phrase ever was that history repeats first as tragedy, then as farce. It's a great quip, but I think it's reductionistic. One of the things to keep in mind is that this is not the first time in Brazil's history, in Brazil's recent history, that buildings like the Congress building have been stormed. In 2013, there were widespread protests throughout Brazil, essentially about public transport, but about more in terms of dysfunction of the government, people's general dissatisfaction. And you can find photos that are amazingly similar of people on the roof of that congressional building just as they were recently. This was, the damage was more extensive to all the buildings. So I don't mean to minimize it by that, but to say that, this is something of a repeat, not just of, America's recent past, but there is a tradition of this widespread discontent, civil unrest in Brazil itself. And Brazil faces its own challenges in its own way. And these buildings, all of which were constructed by the architect Oscar Niemeyer, and were named World Heritage Sites because he was, the sort of principal architect of a lot of what is now the Brazilian capital, Brasilia. These are particularly soft targets. If you see all of these buildings, according to sort of modernist design principles, are supposed to integrate seamlessly into their surroundings. That means a lot of big glass windows on first floors. That means a lot of flat roofs that people can easily get on top of. And you see that very vividly if you watch any of this footage, how people get in. It is considerably easier than the sort of classical architecture we employ in our nation's capital. So all of these are very disturbing, but I think it's important to remember the Brazilian context here, in a context in which you have a very polarized nation, and you have both an outgoing president and now a returned president who were incredibly controversial figures during President Lula's previous terms and President Bolsonaro's most recent term.
You're right about the desire of Americans to filter things through the American perspective, which is, I think, understandable. But one of the things that I find fascinating about that as well is the how it seems to me like what Americans were doing on January 6th, at least compared to what we're seeing in Brazil and what we see in uprisings in the wake of elections in other nations around the world, how much of it in the United States appeared to be like cosplaying. Were they really serious about all of this? Which I think is a meritorious argument to have about the nature of what happened on January 6th. Was this really the making of a coup d'etat of some kind, of a real, actual insurrection? Or was it a bunch of idiots rioting at the United States Capitol because of opportunity and because they had been worked up into a lather by irresponsible people who probably don't actually desire the ends they claim to desire, but were perfectly happy to see violence and destruction happen in the furtherance of causes that they supported, and not just causes they supported, their own individual interests that they were deeply invested in. It does seem to me to be Americans who have, by and large, we have our own American exceptionalism anecdotes that we can point to about Americans being on average more violent and all of that. But the peaceful transition of power was a thing that generally was not questioned for a very long period of time. And it really wasn't affected by what happened on January 6th. But there was some play acting in trying to disrupt it and make it seem more like stories that we hear and what we see coming out of Brazil. I think there is a distinction to be drawn there. The meaning of which I'm not even entirely certain myself. But it is I think, different in character, what we're seeing in Brazil versus what we saw on January 6th. And as somebody who took all of that very seriously, I think we can still draw that distinction.
Both phenomena are extremely rooted in their own history. One of the animating causes of January 6th was the fact that people wanted Congress to refuse to certify the election. And they wanted Congress to in some way sort this out so that it would be different. There's a historical precedent for that in 1876 in the United States, where there's a dispute about the validity of various elections, rival slates of electors. And so this is the appeal, even though what happened on January 6th was fundamentally against the rule of law. It wanted to appeal in some way to a tradition, to a sort of legal process. What you have in Brazil is different in that the object seems to be to create the sort of instability that would require the Brazilian military to intervene and for there to be a military dictatorship. There is historical precedent in Brazil for this, which is very different than anything we've had, thankfully, in the American experience.
I think that's a fair point, although I think that's probably a bit too generous to some of the folks who participated in the January 6th riots. I don't think they were like, all right, guys, we've figured out our historical precedent. We just need to, follow our tradition. I would say even beyond that, in both cases, so maybe I am generalizing again, but I do think there are commonalities from which one can generalize despite well-noted distinctions. There's a difference between having a grievance. There's even a difference between having a cause, just or unjust, and having a plan. The reason why governments do get overthrown, sometimes it's everybody is upset and they riot, and that's when usually the military steps in because they say, well, it's better us in charge than no one. But that's not usually there was some revolutionary, some big thinker, some whatever. It was a practical matter, in a lot of these cases. But that's different than a revolution where someone says, we can build a better government and here's how we do it. And just to be clear, those are usually really bad when they happen, but they come about because there's an actual visionary. There's no visionary behind January 6th. As far as I can tell, like Bolsonaro, whatever you think of him, there are some real parallels to President Trump. Neither of them are these like Thomas Jefferson sort of figures. This is not, or Alexander Hamilton. They're not like creating their own new form of government or anything like that. They just want to be a strongman or a celebrity or both or whatever. So, that's not to say no one should care, no one should worry. But there are differing types and degrees of this sort of thing. And it's important to have that in mind that, whether you like it or don't like it, the level of threat that this represents is not the same as someone, they got their own flags and they got their own constitution and they got their big plan. A lot of times people take up arms and it's absolutely awful, but that's the reason they do it, and they keep fighting a lot longer, and they, everything is much, much bloodier in those cases, for better and worse.
Let's move to our final topic of the day, which is 60 Minutes. Decided to ring in the new year with a piece, the written version of which on their website is titled, "Scientists Say Planet in Midst of 6 Mass Extinction, Earth's Wildlife Running Out of Places to Live." And the person featured in this 60 Minutes piece was the Stanford University biologist Paul Ehrlich. And if that name is familiar to you, it is probably because he is the author of The Population Bomb, a book that came out in, I believe, 1968, that predicted problems and catastrophe associated with the overpopulation of the planet, that we would run out of resources. And, of course, he has this famous bet with Julian Simon that he ends up losing. We can put the details of that into the show notes as well. But he's making very similar claims again. I'll read one of them from the 60 Minutes piece. "I and the vast majority of my colleagues think we've had it, that the next few decades will be the end of the kind of civilization that we are used to," which sounds very similar to, in 10 years, all important animal life in the sea will be extinct. Large areas of coastline will have to be evacuated because of the stench of dead fish. That was a prediction that he made in the late 1960s. Which also did not come to fruition. There's a lot that we could get into about this, especially about the way that it views humanity and the way that humans handle resources and encounter the law of scarcity, which seems to be deeply misunderstood by Paul Ehrlich. But I thought this one, because of course it is 2023, and even Paul Ehrlich is on Twitter. And we'll put this piece in the show notes that includes this tweet, but I just have to read it because it is remarkable to me. 60 Minutes extinction story has brought the usual right wing out in force. If I'm always wrong, so is science, since my work is always peer-reviewed, including the population bomb, and I've gotten virtually every scientific honor. Sure, I've made some mistakes, but no basic ones. Have at it. This is like a piñata in that I feel you can hit this thing from any angle and some reward will fall.
Yeah, I got a few. As executive editor of a peer-reviewed academic journal, I can say that peer review is very important, but peer review is not a stamp of authority. It takes a lot to get a submission through peer review and accepted for publication. But the point then is that other people will read it and they will have their own articles, which may or may not agree or disagree. But you are contributing to a body of scholarship in quantitative sciences. This gets down to a matter of data analysis, replicability, and more qualitative, theory. It's a matter of testing the premises, the soundness of the premises, the validity of the argument, and whether or not there's maybe some other angle that person didn't even think of. Doesn't mean that what you find there you should just throw out and not care about. I think people should actually care a lot more about academia and academic work. It is an important endeavor. That's not to say there aren't its own internal problems, whatever. But you just have to understand what it is, and the average person doesn't. And Paul Ehrlich is not helping. I actually thought of as you're reading that off. 1968. I don't know if that's the exact year, but there is a tradition of American apocalypticism that knows no bounds, just like American Puritanism. You don't actually have to be a Puritan to be puritanical in America. In fact, you could be wildly secular. So around the same time, if I remember correctly, there was also a book called The Late Great Planet Earth, which was more of a kind of evangelical, Jesus is coming back sort of thing. The Great Tribulation is coming, that kind of eschatology. I grew up in that kind of eschatology. Although not exactly. They were a little, the prediction had come and gone.
It was a little later.
Yeah, it was a little later. They were a little.
Earth was a little greater.
A little more cautious. But that's something that I've just left behind, and I feel the same way. Sorry, no pun intended. No pun intended. I feel the same way though.
We should get an endorsement deal for that one. That was fantastic.
I feel the same way about climate issues, not in the sense of not thinking it's serious, because as a Christian, I do believe Jesus will return. I look for the resurrection of the dead and the life of the age to come. I also have looked into climate change, and some listeners may disagree. Some people here at Acton may disagree. I haven't surveyed everyone, but I think it's real. I do think there is an anthropogenic cause, and I think it's something we ought to care about. I also think it's something that we should not panic about. There's a difference between caring and panicking. And I think you see that in Ehrlich and similar responses. So in 1968, he's saying we got a decade left. Obviously, he was wrong, right? Good. Let's be happy about that. Let's not say from this, therefore, we don't need to care about the environment or climate change or anything like that. But we should be able to look soberly at it. We should be able to maybe take a step back from all the alarmism, the apocalypticism that is still current today, evidenced by the fact that the man is still getting featured on 60 Minutes. People adapt. People actually intervene to save endangered species, thank God. People intervene to not only preserve but restore vital environments. There are conservation efforts which have happened and worked. Let's look at those. How did they work? What do we do? There are economic issues. People talk about the poorest of the poor being in these coastal cities, and the ocean levels are going to rise, and things are going to, they're going to be hurt. And I absolutely care. So let's find a way to get them economic development so that they're not stuck in this endangered place, right? There are a lot of angles to look at this. To get back to my original point about peer review and academic publishing, there are a lot of lenses through which we can look at phenomenon in the world today. And just because one person may or may not have a legitimate view and a legitimate worry does not mean that they therefore are science incarnate and can speak with some, kind of irrefutable authority on these issues. What it means, in fact, is that we need every pair of eyes we can from every different perspective looking at these sorts of issues to help us figure out, well, what is the true nature of what we're dealing with, and how do we move forward responsibly in a way that takes seriously our vocation to care for God's world and to care for our neighbor.
What's amazing to me that perhaps maybe shouldn't be is that for as long as Paul Ehrlich has been doing this, it seems that one fundamental error is at the heart of all of his wrong predictions and interpretations, which is just an economic fallacy. It's a zero-sum fallacy. It looks at resources that exist naturally and that humans exploit for their benefit, and looks at the predictions about the stockpiles of those that exist, or we think could potentially exist if we want to think about things like oil and where untapped oil exists. And says, well, if we continue to tap and utilize this resource in the exact same way, projected straightforward over time, then we're going to run out at some point in time. And if you take entirely human ingenuity out of the equation, okay, I understand the point that is trying to be made there. But even in the concept of oil, look at what we're doing with fracking. Look what has been able to be developed with shale gas. That when we are faced with the potential of depleting sources of one thing, human ingenuity is able to define ways to utilize other resources as replacements for them, to utilize things that previously existed in ways that we hadn't utilized them before. And this whole part, this human ingenuity part of it, is completely absent from Ehrlich's analysis of just about everything. There are other, I think, more rudimentary errors, to go back to his point about not making basic errors. Talking about a problem of overpopulation, isn't it? I think I'll have to double check on this, but I think this is correct, that the entire population of the United States could live in the state of Texas with the population density of New York City. And there's all of that land, or maybe it's even the entire world. I can't remember what the actual equation of that is. But even in that sense, just from a land mass perspective, he's so incredibly, unbelievably wrong. And there's a failure of imagination to be able to conceive of all of that. But it also shouldn't be surprising to us, I don't think, that this is the error that Paul Ehrlich makes, because this is somebody, I think if you look at his work over time, with a very dim view of humanity and human ingenuity. It does not think we are capable, that thinks human beings are, in reference to the Matrix here, some kind of a disease that exists on this planet, that doesn't value human life as being important and valuable in and of itself. So it doesn't surprise me that Paul Ehrlich is making errors like this, but nonetheless, that is the error that I see at the heart of all of this, is the failure to understand how human ingenuity can change and how we can utilize different resources differently. And that's why the predictions from people like Ehrlich are always apocalyptic, but the apocalypse never seems to arrive.
If Acton readers would like to see this unpacked brilliantly, it was done so by Julian Simon, the late economist who wrote a book called The Ultimate Resource. Simon and Ehrlich also famously engaged in debates and bets on commodity prices. Simon won those bets, and it's a wonderful read. And really, Simon's not coming at this from a religious perspective, but that notion of the human person is the ultimate resource. The fact that the challenges that we face in the world can be met through service to each other, through human creativity and judgment, is a fantastically encouraging one.
Let's call it a wrap there. I want to thank you for listening to Act and Unwind. If you're listening to this podcast on our website, please look in the show notes where you will find a link to subscribe directly to Act and Unwind, or you can search Act and Unwind on your favorite podcast app. Also, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, 5-star reviews only, so that more people can find this program. Thanks to Dan, thanks to Dylan. For the Acton Institute, I'm Eric Cohn. We'll see you next week.